When it was announced by his daughter a few months ago that Jordan Peterson had gone to Russia to be treated for an excruciating dependency on a prescribed anti-anxiety medication, many people responded with sadness and concern. Some others reacted with happiness and satisfaction. This video is about one of the latter examples. Most people learned about Jordan Peterson's condition from a Canadian newspaper, the National Post, in an article dated February 7th called Jordan Peterson's Year of Absolute Hell. The comments section, while containing its share of well-wishers, was also peppered with vaunting declarations. "Clean your room, bucko," smirked one. Another pontificated, "He's probably just malnourished from eating only beef. How dumb can a person be to think that is a healthy way to live? But then I never thought he was very bright in the first place." A professor of medicine and law at the University of Ottawa, Amir Ataran, tweeted using the hashtag karma. Quote, "Jordan Peterson, oracle to gullible young men, preacher of macho toughness and hectoring bully to snowflakes, is addicted to strong drugs and his brain riddled with neurological damage. He deserves as much sympathy as he showed others," end quote. This professor's tweets were filled with crudely reductive allegations attempting to show that Peterson was a heartless scoundrel, undeserving of compassion despite the near-death severity of his experience. And in the days following, one could find many examples of people taking to social media to crow over a great man brought low. That's the dark side of social media, and not surprising. But when a serious article appears in a supposedly serious magazine doing almost exactly the same thing, it's notable. In March, the New Republic published an article titled "What Happened to Jordan Peterson" by freelance journalist Lindsay Beyerstein, allegedly responding to the fact that Michaela Peterson's description of her father's ordeal, quote, "was met with bafflement by doctors and lay people alike," end quote. So Beyerstein, an award-winning investigative journalist, stepped in to inform us. Purporting to present a medically based overview of Peterson's condition and treatment, she crafted an intellectualized version of the personal smears that abounded on Twitter, full of false assertions about the nature of Peterson's public statements meant to make him appear a self-deluded, self-aggrandizing hypocrite at best, an outright dangerous charlatan at worst. Let me say up front that, of course, Peterson as a very public figure is rightly open to criticism, but when the criticism is based on distortions and fabrications, it becomes an object lesson in how self-declared thought leaders delude themselves and others about their motives. In the remainder of this video, I'm going to look in some detail at Beyerstein's attack on Peterson to show how every major assertion is either unproven and unprovable or outright false. From the beginning, it is obvious that Lindsay Beyerstein doesn't wish Peterson well and takes some satisfaction in his apparent fall from the pinnacle he had reached. After telling us that Peterson has been, quote, called the most influential public intellectual in the Western world, end quote, she mentions that he is an exponent of the Jungian concept of the hero's journey, and then in a parenthesis says that, quote, he has described himself without apparent irony as being raised and toughened in the frigid wastelands of northern Alberta, end quote. Well, perhaps the irony was just not apparent to Beyerstein. But seriously, I'm not sure why she thought it remarkable that Peterson would say this, quote, without irony. Why need he be ironic? Northern Alberta is a harsh land that toughens those who live there, many of them, as Peterson reports in 12 Rules for Life, desperate to escape. So is Peterson a tough character? I would say so. Over the last 4 years, he withstood sustained attack for questioning the wisdom of Bill C-16, the bill introduced by the Canadian government to make gender identity and gender expression protected grounds of discrimination and to compel the use of preferred pronouns. The attack on Peterson included a letter signed by hundreds of his own colleagues at the University of Toronto calling on the university to fire him. As far as I know, he had not a single declared defender among the people he had worked with for decades. He came very close to being fired for questioning a government decree about gender. He was called a transphobe, a queerphobe, a misogynist, and a danger to the safety of marginalized students. Academics all across the world spoke out against him. Journalists and broadcasters put him in their crosshairs. He was baited and interrogated, his every statement scrutinized and taken out of context if possible to imply that he sought a return to the Dark Ages. Withstanding all that did indeed require toughness of a sort that very few people, especially academics, possess. And he not only withstood, but did so with grace and wit and intellectual virtuosity, routing Channel 4 news presenter Kathy Newman, for one, with a winsome smile. But Beyerstein, mentioning none of this, has already left facts behind. She goes on saying, quote, his stern ethos of self-help and bootstrapping has made him a darling of the so-called intellectual dark web and a gateway drug for countless budding right-wingers who have stumbled upon one of his lectures on YouTube, end quote. This is a supercilious statement full of snide oversimplifications. It's hard to know where to begin with it. As for, quote, stumbling upon one of his lectures on YouTube, I'd love to know how Beyerstein came to learn of Jordan Peterson. Did she receive some form of telepathic communication, a message from the gods, perhaps? Or instead of stumbling, did she stride toward his videos, having been alerted by her friends that a very bad man was attracting the attention of the contemptible plebes and should be stopped by the righteous elect? It's actually not clear how much of Peterson's voluminous writing and lectures this author has actually bothered with. She seems to be going mainly on hearsay, as for example in calling Peterson's a, quote, stern ethos. This is a man who has wept numerous times in interviews and videos when he spoke of the literally hundreds of thousands of people who have been touched by his message that their lives matter. Yes, he appeals to the hundreds of thousands of young men in particular, as well as others, who have been made to feel that their society doesn't like them very much due to their sex and or race. He has personally spoken to thousands of people after his talks who have told him how his words of encouragement and sanity gave them the belief that they weren't worthless. That seems a lot less stern than the countless workshops and university courses and magazine articles and government programs and political leaders' statements advising men to acknowledge their toxic masculinity and their unearned privilege and their propensity to benefit from the rape culture they are supposedly complicit in. For some of these men, Jordan Peterson has been literally a lifesaver. Beyerstein's full phrase referred to Peterson's, quote, stern message of self-help and bootstrapping, end quote, one of the most ludicrous of her many mischaracterizations. Peterson's bestseller, 12 Rules for Life, is a combination of philosophical reflection and personal narrative informed by Peterson's work in clinical psychology and his study of myth. It is hardly a self-help book, except in the loosest sense. Using the Bible, Jung, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, and others, it seeks to demonstrate that the quest for meaning is still possible and necessary in our age and is the best bulwark against the inevitability of suffering and human evil. For many of Peterson's followers, intellectually nourished on little other than race, gender, and sexuality, and constantly being told that their only significant identity depends on where they find themselves in the pecking order of righteous victimhood or loathsome privilege, Peterson's prescription for meaning is indeed liberating. How shocking that so many, including university students, had to wait for this man to tell them about it, and how equally shocking that people like Lindsay Beyerstein react to their exhilarated discovery with name-calling and contempt. Such contempt is expressed in her reference to Peterson as a, quote, darling of the so-called intellectual dark web and a gateway drug for countless budding right-wingers, end quote. The sinister implications are laughable. We're supposed to assume that after you watch a few Jordan Peterson videos, you're on your way to Hitler's final solution. It so happens that Peterson has never described himself as right-wing, and it's impossible to describe as right-wing the masses of people who have become interested in his ideas. They're from all across the political spectrum, and many aren't political at all. Many are simply sick to death of the prissy, moralizing, self-righteous, and dishonest pablum that passes for elite opinion today. The basis for Beyerstein's disdain for right-wingers is, of course, never articulated. She goes on, quote, so it was something of a surprise to learn in early February that Peterson had spent 8 days in a medically induced coma at an unnamed clinic in Russia, end quote. Why was it a surprise, or something of one? Peterson has spoken openly about his battles with depression and anxiety over the years. He has never presented himself as invulnerable. On the contrary, he has consistently made it clear that his interests in psychology and myth are a response to the pain of being as he has experienced it. So in what sense is it surprising that he would have troubles involving anti-anxiety medication at the time his wife was undergoing cancer treatment? The despicable suggestion is that he presented himself as having all the answers and that his difficulty now somehow proves he never did. Beyerstein goes on to gloat that, quote, dependency goes against the core tenets of Peterson's philosophical brand, stoicism, self-reliance, the power of the will over circumstance and environment, end quote. And she quotes Peterson, supposedly to prove this. No one gets away with anything ever, so take responsibility for your own life, he is said to have admonished. I'm not sure how advocating responsibility and counseling against dependency are such shocking things, but the fact is that Peterson's philosophy is not one of, quote, stoicism, self-reliance, and the power of the will over circumstance and environment, end quote. His philosophy might include these qualities as ideals to strive for when possible and desirable, but Peterson has never argued that the power of the will is all that is required to overcome pain or disaster. On the contrary, he is deeply aware of the opposite, as innumerable examples from 12 Rules for Life could illuminate. On page 216 of the book, for example, he states that, quote, even well-lived lives can, of course, be warped and hurt and twisted by illness and infirmity and uncontrollable catastrophe. Depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, like cancer, all involve biological factors beyond the individual's immediate control. The difficulties intrinsic to life itself are sufficient to weaken and overwhelm each of us, pushing us beyond our limits, breaking us at our weakest point. Not even the best lived life provides an absolute defense against vulnerability, end quote. Here is a clear refutation of Beyerstein's main point in the article, that Peterson advocates so-called bootstrapping, and it is an excellent illustration of Peterson's compassion for human suffering and awareness of its power to break us all. To suggest, as Beyerstein does, that he was a faker who pretended to be Superman in order to attract followers is an outrageous distortion. The rest of the article takes a deep dive into Peterson's health problems and treatment decisions, the purpose of which is not entirely clear, given that neither Beyerstein nor the various health professionals she claims to have consulted, she quotes only one, actually examined Peterson or were given access to details of his diagnosis and treatment. But the point of the long, rather prurient exegesis seems to be twofold. First, to suggest that Peterson made mistakes in his choices about treatment because of his alleged bootstrap philosophy. And second, to suggest that Peterson can't be trusted in anything he says because he proved unable to deal reasonably with his medication dependency. Here is the nub of Beyerstein's argument. She says, quote, "Based on interviews with medical professionals and a close reading of various statements that Michaela and Peterson himself have made on podcasts and social media, it is clear that Peterson ended up in Russia after an extended battle to wean himself of clonazepam. And it seems likely that Peterson, a self-proclaimed man of science, succumbed to the lure of a quack treatment with devastating consequences," end quote. The author's unprovable but damning contention is that Peterson got himself into his predicament because he couldn't treat his problems simply as physical. He needed to act the hero of his own favored myths. One of the big issues in Beyerstein's article is the possibility that Peterson became psychologically addicted to, not simply physically dependent on, the anxiety medication he had been prescribed. Even while admitting that there is no evidence that he was so addicted, she keeps insinuating that he may have been, and that, of course, he and his family would hide the fact. She even takes the fact that Michaela joked about the likelihood that Peterson's enemies would pile on the idea of a psychological addiction as a kind of evidence that perhaps it was true. The entire argument rests on misdirection and insinuation. At one point, again trying to push the image of Peterson as a false prophet, Beyerstein implies that he has consistently underestimated the reality of addiction. She says, quote, "Dependence and addiction are health issues, not character defects, and if you pressed Peterson on that point, he'd probably agree. However, that message is a tough sell to many of Peterson's fans who are drawn to his macho image and his personal story of triumph over adversity," end quote. The inaccuracy here, either deliberate or from ignorance, is staggering. You wouldn't have to push Peterson to admit that dependency and addiction are health issues. And he doesn't cultivate a macho image or claim to have triumphed over adversity. Here he is on page 125 of 12 Rules for Life, talking about the human condition with compelling honesty and compassion for human frailty. He says, quote, "Why do people take drugs? Not a mystery. It's why they don't take them all the time that's the mystery. Why do people suffer from anxiety? That's not a mystery. How is it that people can ever be calm? There's the mystery. We're breakable and mortal. A million things can go wrong in a million ways," end quote. And on page 149, he went on to emphasize that, quote, "Human control is limited. Susceptibility to despair, disease, aging, and death is universal. In the final analysis, we do not appear to be the architects of our own fragility," end quote. It becomes evident that Beyerstein has created a straw man of Jordan Peterson, solely, it seems, to delight in knocking it down. In most of the rest of the article, Beyerstein attempts to provide a medical analysis of Peterson's condition and his treatment choices to show that Peterson made bad decisions because he couldn't bear to face his drug dependency honestly. The possibility that Peterson attempted in good faith to follow the medical advice of North American doctors and ultimately found them unable to help him is never seriously considered in the article, though it is the most likely explanation. Only one doctor is quoted in the entire Beyerstein piece, Dr. Olivera Bogunovic at Boston's McLean Hospital, and she, of course, can do no more than speak generally about benzodiazepine dependence, admitting that not all sufferers successfully undergo gradual withdrawal, the program at her hospital, and that a small percentage of people do suffer from a paradoxical reaction of precisely the sort Michaela described, meaning that rather than lessening their anxiety, the medication profoundly increases it, leading to unbearable discomfort, as Michaela described. This doctor's statements make it clear that there's nothing particularly baffling about the story Michaela told about her father, as was stated by Beyerstein near the beginning of the article. When, near the end of the article, Beyerstein takes the opportunity to deride Michaela's motives and to conclude that Peterson was his own worst enemy, it's no longer necessary to take seriously contentions that are based on nothing other than malignant speculation. Quote, Michaela is essentially weaving her own hero's journey, says Beyerstein, into her father's ordeal, one in which she brought him to a far-flung clinic that had the guts to do what Western doctors wouldn't. It's a tale that burnishes her brand as a wellness influencer and shoves aside awkward questions about whether the treatment harmed Peterson, end quote. Given that neither Beyerstein nor the single medical doctor she quoted can prove or even plausibly allege that Peterson was harmed rather than helped by his treatment, this is rather an unfair charge. When Beyerstein ends her article by declaring Peterson's story a sad one, I have trouble believing that she felt even one jot of sadness as she wrote it. She remains committed to her mischaracterization of Peterson right up to the last statement, which is, quote, if Peterson's sad story has a moral, it's that a drug problem is neither a dragon to be slain nor a sin to be ashamed of. It's a mundane health problem that should be treated scientifically without heroics, end quote. Well, it must feel good to sit back with no real knowledge of the case and with no personal distress about the suffering involved to speculate and sermonize about the decisions made by two people caught up in the pain, fear, panic, and uncertainty of a horrific physical reaction to a medication. Ironically, though Beyerstein claims that illness is physical, not moral, the implication throughout her article is that Peterson has been morally exposed as a fake shaman and that the story of his health woes and possible addiction should put an end to the respect he has won. It won't do that because Beyerstein doesn't know enough to begin to make her case and has not done justice to Peterson's real message in 12 Rules for Life. Her article is bad enough that, in my opinion, it's ripe for a defamation lawsuit. Most people are prone to the vice of taking pleasure in the suffering of someone they dislike. I'm guilty of it too. Some of us, though, recognize the vice for the despicable thing it is and fight against it with our better natures. As Peterson advises in 12 Rules for Life, it's useful to, quote, become aware of your own insufficiency, your cowardice, malevolence, resentment, and hatred, end quote. If Beyerstein had read and taken to heart 12 Rules for Life, she might have thought better of the article that revealed her own malignant ill-wishing.